Before you test, DNA basics you need to know. Hi, I'm Drew Smith, and this is part 2 of a 3-part series. In this part, we'll be talking about YDNA. We're going to be learning about how YDNA differs from other kinds of DNA. Also, and what's very important, how YDNA is inherited. And finally, what are the results of a YDNA test? What can they tell you? There are two major types of nuclear DNA. In part 1, we talked about how mitochondrial DNA was separate from nuclear DNA. But once we focus on nuclear DNA, we learn there are two types of that. One type is called autosomal DNA, and we'll be talking about that one in some detail in part 3. The other kind of nuclear DNA is called allosomal DNA, which are probably better known as the sex-determining chromosomes. And so we find that there are either X or Y, where women have two X typically, and males typically have one X and one Y. We're going to be focusing on that Y chromosome that males have. But before we get into that, let's take a look at all of those chromosomes, all those nuclear DNA chromosomes, the 23 pairs that we have, where one comes from each of our parents, and they're numbered. Chromosome pair 1 is the longest pair, chromosome 2 is the next longest, all the way down to some fairly short pairs, pairs 21 and 22. And then you see X and Y, just to get a sense of how they look in terms of size compared to the other chromosomes. It's also important to note that they're called X and Y not because of their shape. Those were just arbitrary letters given to them to distinguish them. If there had been a third one, it would have been called Z. But we're going to focus on that Y chromosome, the one that's relatively short, about as small as the chromosome pairs 21 and 22. YDNA. So what is different about YDNA? It is, as I say, allosomal DNA, not autosomal DNA, and it's found in the nucleus. Only males have it. And it is therefore has to be inherited from the father, since a mother has no YDNA to give her sons. Now, of course, this makes some sense in a way. It's really the YDNA and the presence of the YDNA that typically results in a child developing as a male. Now, one of the things that's interesting about YDNA for genealogists is this inheritance pattern from father to son, because it mimics the inheritance patterns that we often see in a lot of genealogical research where children inherit their father's surname. And if that's the case, that we're dealing with cultures in which children, certainly boys, inherit their father's surname, and boys also inherit their father's YDNA, then that means that the YDNA is somewhat linked to a particular surname. However, we have to be aware of the fact that there can be misattributed paternity, that someone's biological father is not the father of record or the father that is believed to be the father. And of course, in those cases, the YDNA is going with the biological, the genetic father, and not the legal father, the father on paper. So the inheritance pattern is relatively simple. Males, the only ones who have YDNA, inherit it from their fathers, who inherited it from their fathers, who had inherited it from their fathers, going back again hundreds of thousands of years among humanity. In other words, it's kind of a parallel to the mitochondrial DNA that's matrilineal. We see that YDNA is patrilineal. It goes along the patrilineal lines of our ancestry. So what if I take a YDNA test? In reality, there's only one company that's offering the kinds of YDNA testing that we would find useful for genealogical purposes, and that's Family Tree DNA. They actually offer quite a few different ones. But let's focus at this point on just a typical YDNA test that you might take. I took one in 2012, and I'm going to show you what my matches look like. As you can see, I have only one match. Now I took what's called at that time a 37 marker test. This is the least expensive of all the different YDNA tests you could take. As the name implies, it actually just checks 37 locations on the Y chromosome to see what's there, and then compares those with the same locations on your match's YDNA to see if they are the same or not. Now, I only show one match, but that match is not even a perfect match. You can see there's a genetic distance of 3. This tells me that this person, whose name I've redacted, that person and I do not have a perfect alignment of our 37 markers. We actually only have a perfect match of 34 of those. The other 3 are slightly off. They've mutated from our common ancestor. So it's very likely that the gentleman, we can call him Mr. Smith since I'm a Mr. Smith and this is our surname in common, that the other Mr. Smith and I probably do descend from a common Smith ancestor, but we would have to go back pretty far in time, perhaps several hundred years. If I was very fortunate, I would have a genetic distance of 0, and I would have multiple matches, and certainly some YDNA testers discover this. They may have dozens of matches. And there are others who have a unique name, and because they have a unique name and maybe no one else with that surname has tested, they may find that when they take a YDNA test, they have no matches at all. Now it's possible that if you end up with lots of matches, although I didn't, I could test more markers to help me figure out which of those matches are more closely related to me, which of those matches are more distant. The other Mr. Smith is actually tested all the way up to 111. As a matter of fact, I have too. But he and I don't share a lot of other matches that are going to make any difference here. Just as with the mitochondrial testing that we covered in part 1, you can see that there's an envelope icon that lets me click through and communicate with my match or the person managing his test if it's not him. And there's a note icon if I want to make private notes. There's also what's called a tip report. It's just a way to estimate based on the comparison of my YDNA and the match's YDNA probably how many generations back we would need to go to find the common ancestor. So it's an estimated distance of relationship. Off to the right, you'll also see a few other things we won't have time to get to in this presentation, such as haplogroups and terminal SNPs. And of course, there's the date on which I matched the other Mr. Smith. The other Mr. Smith's genealogy is traced back to a Patrick Smith in County Antrim, Ireland in the early 1800s. When I first took a YDNA test, I had a particular question in mind. I knew my Smiths were from Ireland. I did not know where. And I didn't really have any information other than the name of the immigrant ancestor. So I was hoping that when I took a YDNA test that I would match some other Mr. Smiths, and that maybe they had ancestors from Ireland, and perhaps their ancestors then were from a particular county, which would tell me where mine was from. As it turns out, later I discovered that my Smiths were not from County Antrim, though. They were from County Cavan, and from around the same period of time. That means that Patrick Smith, born in County Antrim, and my ancestor, Philip, born in County Cavan, probably are cousins of some nature, descended, but we don't know how far back we have to go to get to their common ancestor. So let's now summarize what we can do and know about YDNA. You have a lot of choices of YDNA tests. You can start, as I might recommend, particularly if your budget is only going to allow you to do that, is to start with a Y37 marker test. This is a good entry point, a way to get into YDNA testing. You can also upgrade even after you've originally tested, because Family Tree DNA does keep your DNA sample in its fridge in case you want to order other kinds of tests with it. And so you could upgrade later to say a Y111 marker test if you found that useful. There's another kind of test called a big Y, and that involves at least 700 markers. It actually is quite extensive and is probably the most extensive YDNA test you could take today. It can be useful and interesting if you really are researching that family line and want to work with other researchers. By the way, many of the YDNA tests, because they're focused on surnames, there are actually surname projects, websites that are maintained. There's one for all those Smiths. Of course, I don't match, or I'm not related to everyone with the surname Smith. Lots of different people have adopted that surname in different parts of the world over time. But nonetheless, there are these surname projects that let you interact with other people who are trying to figure out who these different groups are and how they're related to each other. But as I said, you may find that if you take a YDNA test, you may get a lot of matches, or you may only get a few, or you might not get any at all. That can happen. In order to do a YDNA test, you really need to be focused on your patrilineal line, because a YDNA test is not going to tell you anything about your mother's family. It's not going to tell you anything about your father's mother's family. It's only going to be able to tell you about, seriously, that series of men that have that same surname going back in time. So you have to think about what kind of research problem that might be useful to do YDNA testing. I should probably add, though, that even if you don't have the surname of interest, let's say that I'm interested in my mother's maiden name, Martin, a YDNA test that I take won't tell me anything about the Martin family. But I have Martin cousins. They are the sons and grandsons of my mother's brothers, and they would carry the Martin YDNA. In the same way, I could have more distant cousins help me out with YDNA testing on other surnames. When those men carry those surnames, they can do the YDNA test. So you may find that some of your relatives need to help you out here. This is the end of part 2, and in part 3 we'll cover autosomal DNA and a little bit more about the companies that offer it.